You are allowed to grieve things that were never given a funeral, the career that quietly died, the friendship that faded without a goodbye, the version of yourself you had to bury while still alive, the dream you let go of so slowly that nobody noticed it was gone, including you. You are allowed to grieve all of it, even if nobody else knows it happened. There is a kind of grief that the world has no language for, not the grief that comes with funerals and condolence cards and casseroles left on doorsteps. The world knows how to hold that grief. It has rituals for it, timelines for it, socially acceptable ways of expressing it and moving through it. I am talking about the other kind. The grief for the marriage that ended before it ended, the years spent in the same house with someone who had already left in every way that mattered. The grief for the parent who was physically present but emotionally somewhere else, the childhood spent waiting for a version of them that never arrived. The grief for the identity that had to be abandoned, the person who wanted to be an artist, a traveller, a different kind of human entirely, who made the practical choice and has been quietly mourning that choice ever since. The grief for the body that changed in ways that were not chosen. The grief for the city that was left behind. The grief for the friendship that did not survive the transition, the person who was the closest person in the world for a decade and is now just a name that comes up in old photographs. The grief for the version of the future that was planned so carefully and arrived so differently. These losses did not come with funerals. They did not come with the formal permission to fall apart, to say out loud that something real has ended, to receive from the people around you the acknowledgement that something worth grieving actually happened. And so they were carried, silently, in the space between what was lost and what could be said about it. And the silence, that specific, heavy, unwitnessed silence, is the thing that makes this kind of grief the most dangerous kind. Before I go any further, I want to ask one thing. In the comments right now, just finish this sentence. Nobody knows I am still grieving blank. You do not have to explain it. You do not have to justify it. Just name it, because naming it is the beginning of everything. In 1969, psychiatrist Elisabeth Kübler-Ross introduced the world to what became the most referenced framework for grief in the history of psychology, the 5 stages that most people know by heart. But what Kübler-Ross herself said in the final years of her life in interviews and writings that most people never saw was this. The model was never meant to be a prescription. It was never meant to suggest that grief has a correct sequence, a proper timeline, or a legitimate category of losses that qualify for the process. It was an observation, and the observation was incomplete, because the grief that fills the most hospital rooms, the most therapists' offices, the most 3 a.m. silences, is not the grief for acknowledged losses. It is the grief for the unacknowledged ones. Psychologist Pauline Boss at the University of Minnesota spent 40 years studying what she called ambiguous loss that occurs without official recognition, without social permission, without the cultural rituals that allow grief to be processed and witnessed. Her research found something that should be in every psychology textbook and is in almost none. Ambiguous loss is consistently more difficult to process than acknowledged loss, not because the loss is larger, but because the absence of permission to grieve it prevents the grief from moving. When a death occurs, grief has a container, a funeral, a date, a socially recognized before and after. The grief is witnessed, named, and given space to exist. And because it is given space to exist, it can eventually, non-linearly, messily begin to move. When an ambiguous loss occurs, a dream quietly abandoned, a relationship that ended without ending, an identity surrendered without ceremony, there is no container. The grief has no social home. The people around the grieving person often cannot see that anything has happened because nothing happened that the world has a name for, and grief that has no container does not disappear. It goes underground. It becomes what Boss called frozen grief that cannot move because it was never given permission to begin. And frozen grief stored in the body, carried in the silences, expressed sideways in the exhaustion and the numbness and the low-grade sadness that is always present and never fully explained, is the grief that quietly reshapes a life, not because the person is weak, because the loss was real and the permission was never given. Here is the thing about grief that nobody told you. It does not need to be proportional to be legitimate. The grief for a dream does not need to be smaller than the grief for a person. The grief for a version of yourself does not need to justify its size before it is allowed to exist. The grief for a life that did not happen is not less real than the grief for a life that did. Grief is not a competition, and the losses that never got funerals deserved one just as much as the ones that did. I want to say something directly, and I want to say it as clearly as it can be said. What was lost was real. It does not matter that the world did not see it. It does not matter that there was no ceremony for it, no condolence card, no official acknowledgement that something ended. It does not matter that explaining it to people results in a blank look or a well-meaning but completely inadequate response like, "At least you still have," or "It could be so much worse." The loss was real. The grief for it is legitimate. And the permission to grieve it, the permission that was never formally given, that was waited for, that was hoped someone would offer, that permission is being given right now. Grieve the career that quietly died while still showing up to it. Grieve the marriage that ended years before the paperwork. Grieve the version of yourself that had to be set aside when the practical thing took over. Grieve the friendships that did not survive the growing. Grieve the city, the dream, the body, the future that arrived differently than planned. Grieve the parent who was there but not there. Grieve the childhood that was competent and functional and quietly lonely in ways that were only understood years later. Grieve the version of the family that was hoped for and did not happen. Grieve it all, not because grieving it will make it unhappen, but because grief, when it is finally given permission to exist, begins to move. And grief that moves, grief that is witnessed, named, and allowed to be what it is eventually transforms into something that frozen grief never can. It transforms into understanding, into clarity, into the specific, compassionate, deeply personal wisdom that only comes from having genuinely mourned something real. There is something I want this comment section to become right now. A witness. If there is a loss that was carried in silence, something that was never officially grieved because nobody gave permission, because no one would understand, because it happened so slowly that even the exact moment it ended was not noticed, write it here. Just a sentence, just a few words. Because every person reading these comments is someone who is also carrying something that was never given a funeral. And witnessing each other's grief even through a screen, even between strangers, is one of the most profoundly human things that can be done. Post it below. One quick moment before the final section. This content takes real time and dedication to create. If it is reaching something real today, please consider supporting this work. The QR code is on screen now. The link is in the pinned comment. A free companion PDF is in the pinned comment as well. It has the written exercises that go with this video, designed to help do what the video points toward. Download it. And if what is being carried right now feels too heavy to carry alone, private readings are available through the link in the description. Now, the most important part. Here is what happens when grief is finally allowed to move. It does not feel the way it was expected to feel. There is an assumption built from the cultural narrative about grief that allowing grief to exist means falling apart. That naming what was lost means being consumed by the loss. That giving the unnamed griefs a funeral means going back to all the darkness of when they happened. That assumption is wrong. What actually happens when grief is finally given permission, when the thing that was lost is finally named, witnessed, and allowed to be real, is something much quieter. It feels like putting down something heavy, not the dramatic drop of a sudden release. The quiet, almost imperceptible setting down of a weight that has been carried for so long that the body had stopped registering it as weight and started registering it as normal. The exhaustion that was always present and never fully explained begins to make sense. The low-grade sadness that lived beneath the surface of ordinary days begins to have a source. The numbness that made it hard to be fully present in the good moments begins to lift slowly, imperfectly, non-linearly, because the grief that was producing it is finally being given space to exist rather than space to hide. This is what Boss's research on ambiguous loss found when people were finally given the language and the permission to grieve what they had lost. Not collapse. Clarification. Not breakdown. Breakthrough. The frozen grief, when it begins to thaw, does not flood everything. It becomes grief that moves, and grief that moves, however slowly, however non-linearly, eventually arrives somewhere. It arrives at the truth of what was lost, what it meant, and who remains in the absence of it. There is one practice done once with honesty, in whatever private space feels safe, that begins the thawing of frozen grief. It is called the Unwitnessed losses list. Take a piece of paper. At the top, write today's date, and then, without editing, without judging whether the loss is large enough to deserve space on the page, without comparing it to what other people have lost, list every unacknowledged loss being carried. The losses that were never named, the griefs that were never witnessed, the funerals that were never held. Write them down, as many as come, as small as they seem, as long ago as they happened. This is not a therapy exercise. It is not a productivity tool. It is simply the act of giving these losses what they were always owed, a witness. Even if the only witness is the piece of paper, even if the only ceremony is the act of writing it down, even if the only acknowledgement is the acknowledgement given to oneself. Because grief to begin to move does not need to be witnessed by the world. It needs to be witnessed. The list is the witness. When the list is complete, read it back, slowly. Let each item on it be seen, be real, be acknowledged as the genuine loss it always was. And then at the bottom of the page, write 4 words. These losses were real, because they were, all of them. Every loss on that list deserved a funeral. Every grief on that list deserved space to exist. Every version of self, every dream, every relationship, every life unlived that made it onto that page. All of it was real, and all of it deserved to be grieved. The grief that was never given permission to exist did not disappear. It became the weight behind the eyes, the distance in the room, the difficulty being fully present in the good moments. Naming it does not make it worse. Naming it is the beginning of making it lighter. One last thing for the comments. After doing the unwitnessed losses list, or even just thinking about what would go on it, I want to ask, what is one loss from that list that feels lighter just from being named? Even one word, even one sentence. Because this comment section is about to become the most honest, most human space on the internet today. And someone reading it, someone who has been carrying their unwitnessed grief alone for years, needs to see that naming it is possible. That the other side of naming it exists. Post it below. There is nothing wrong with the grief that was carried in silence. There was never anything wrong with it. The world simply did not have a container for it. The people around were not equipped to witness it. The losses happened in the spaces between the recognized events of a life, quietly, without ceremony, without the social acknowledgement that would have made the grief feel legitimate. But legitimate does not require witnesses to be true. The losses were real. The grief for them is real. And the permission to grieve, the permission that was never formally given, that was waited for, that was hoped would come from somewhere outside, it was always there. It was always yours to give to yourself. The funeral does not need a congregation. It just needs you. If this reached something real, if something on that invisible list finally got to be named, send this to one person who is carrying grief that was never given a funeral. Not to fix them, not to explain their grief to them, just to give them permission. The free PDF with the full unwitnessed losses exercise is in the pinned comment. Download it. The work continues there. Subscribe. The next message goes even deeper.